Whatto chaps, I'm Magical Mike and I'd like to ask and answer a few questions about the Elementalist elite specialization, the Catalyst. Hopefully I can explain quickly, but probably not with the amount of skills that we have here, what it does, how it does that thing, and most importantly, how it feels and is it fun to play. And if you like the video then do please leave a like and consider subscribing for more like this. Thanks. First up, let's see what ArenaNet thinks the Catalyst is all about, and then I'll take it through some Dragon Response missions, strikes, and some open world mobs.
Catalysts have revitalized ancient techniques for channeling elemental forces, with a few modern improvements. They use jade tech spheres to create concentrated wells of immense power. Using their augment abilities within range of the spheres enhances their effects. With the weight of Tyria's fundamental magics behind every blow from their hammers, these elementalists are a steady presence in melee combat.
Concentrated wells of immense power. Ha! Now that's a laugh. Funny they call the mechanic a well here too, because it just is not. The rest is about right though. The Catalyst gets all new access to the hammer as its weapon, augment utility skills, and a new F5 class mechanic called the Jade Tech Sphere, acting like a well, but not being classed as such. Interestingly, the Catalyst itself isn't all that different to a core Elementalist. In fact, if you've played a lot of core Ele, you'll find this spec to be rather familiar. It focuses and thrives on doing combo finishes, together increasing strength and buffs, much more so than a Weaver or a Tempest, but can still choose to do some more supporty playstyles like that, or even be more of a bruiser too. While the new hammer can feel quite weighty and slow, adding a whole new style to the Ele's arsenal, choosing to use older weapons can really allow the Catalyst to shine, despite being a detriment to the whole newness of the hammer. And yes, a hammer, probably not what you expected or perhaps wanted, but let's see if you're interested in the 20 new skills it comes with. We'll go through these in a general sense and make mention of some of the more interesting ones. By the way, I'm using Celestial gear in this video, so damage will be higher on a Xerxes, but survivability much lower. Conditions aren't very good on hammer though, which is also worth a mention. So auto attacks, a common theme here is that fire and air skills are all ranged, while earth and water are melee based, meaning that the Catalyst should either be moving in and out of melee combat to maximise its kit, or simply staying in melee even though some of those attacks are ranged. So fire and air autos are just basic projectiles. Water autos apply chill, but they're a chain of melee hits, so you have to commit to hitting 3 of them for the chill. Earth autos hit in a ring of earth around you, which I quite enjoy the animation of. In fact, it's worth noting immediately that the hammer has some really cool animations that make it feel heavy and sell the idea of swinging a huge lump of metal around. Skill 2 in Earth is a good example of that, spinning around rather slowly and applying a few bleeds. It feels cool, but it does such low damage and locks you in an animation that it kind of ruins the skill a bit. In water you do a little flurry of 100 blade-like hits, and air creates this brilliant localized tornado while you furiously spin around. Great animation, but again though, you're locked in place for a long cast time. Skill 4 in Fire is another fairly weak feeling thing, just a triangle of fire on the ground that hits 3 times. In Earth it's a 1-second block that gives you an aura if you use it right, and you can also attunement swap if you're quick-fingered enough to choose which elemental aura you'll get. Air 4 is a knockdown which blows you back, which would be really cool if it didn't put you out of range of all of your abilities. And Water 4 is a leap finisher back in that heals you too, based on how many things you hit with it. Fire 5 is a rather odd melee range blast finisher, same with Earth 5. Air 5 is another blast that also throws this delayed stun projectile, which is quite odd to use. And finally, every skill 3 spawns an orb that rotates around you, dealing damage as it passes through things, gives you a passive benefit, and refreshes in duration if you use another attunement skill 3 before it drops, having up to 4 rotating damagey orbs all giving you passives. You can also choose to shoot these orbs at an enemy for more effects, but it's best to try and preserve the passives on you for as long as possible. For what it's worth, I like the feel and animations on a lot of these skills, apart from the fire ones that feel kind of weak, but Air 4's blowback is really satisfying, so is the tornado, and if Earth had more damage to it, I'd really love that too. Unfortunately, since the orb mechanic on skill 3 is so integral and vital to getting the most out of the hammer, it ends up forcing you to rotate in a specific order to upkeep those passives. It also means that you barely get enough time to cast more than one skill per achievement, since there's a few animation locks or slow casting blast finishes that you need to keep on top of. Fresh air can help keep on top of this by letting you toggle some ferocity often enough, but it is a further button to press and think about in an already complex rotation. The orbs also count as projectiles while spinning around you, meaning you'll often lose them to projectile mitigating defensive skills, which ends up feeling really bad. You'll notice that every element has a combo finisher on it, but no combo field access, which is important to note. Overall, I like the idea of Hammer, I like the potential of it and how some of those skills feel, but it has some fundamental problems in its kit and its playstyle. A few suggestions to improve it would be to give it some combo field access in the skills. Maybe Fire 4 could linger for just a couple of seconds. Maybe Air 2 could be a lightning field. Maybe Water 5 too. Really push the idea that the Catalyst is all about combos. They don't have to be strong, but they do have to be there, because the hammer's just lacking. Maybe also allow the orbs to be a bit easier to upkeep, and perhaps add whirl finishes to Earth 2 and Air 2, making you want to use the tornado and then move into it as well for some brutal bolts. I don't know, maybe that's too much. Oh, and maybe make Earthfall's block trigger at the end of the duration, so that you can actually pick an attunement with it. Lots of things to talk about the hammer, so let's move on. Your utility skills are called augments. Frankly, every single one of these felt uninspired and inferior to already existing Ellie skills for me. Each has a different effect, a barely noticeable animation, and a further effect if cast within your Profession F5 mechanic. The heal was okay, being a little bit better than the Ether Renewal that you have already, basically being a heal over time. The block was also okay, coming in handy to buy time now and again. Also gives you a big barrier if you're in your Earth sphere. The 5% damage buff from fire was again just okay, and the same with extra strikes from shattering ice. This one at least speeds up your energy gain for your Jade Orb, but since it's just a tiny rotating orb at your feet for the animation, it's not a very satisfying pick. Again. Same for all of the augments, the animations just weren't exciting. Though I will give credit to the air one for being a simple stun break, which is just handy now and again. And finally comes the Elite, which is probably the worst Elite in the entire game? This allows you to shave up to 8 seconds off your weapon skill cooldowns, as long as you hit enough attacks during the time. This is not even utility skill cooldowns, just weapon skills. Granted, that is 20 skills you're shaving down on Elementalist, but why you'd ever pick this over, say, Fiery Greatsword, Tornado, or the Elemental, I don't really know. Oh, and there's some basic boons attached to it too, in case you're playing an Ellie that somehow doesn't have them all maxed out already. I ended up mostly forgetting or choosing to ignore all of these secondary effects, since most of them weren't that useful, or because it was much more of a pain to make sure I was not only in the right attunement to use them, but also within Jade Orb range. There's too many stipulations on these things, not enough flexibility, and these utilities I think were just rubbish, and honestly I only kept using a couple of them for the sake of the video. I'd much rather have had 2 Signets, Glyph of Storms, a Stun Break, Lightning Flash, or hell, even a Conjured Weapon in some cases. Suggestions here would be to just make these skills more interesting somehow, give them more flavour but ditch the requirement to be in your orb, or make the benefit easier to get, or much, much stronger. I don't know, I'm kinda stumped by the augments. So what about its major mechanic then? Maybe that'll make things better. Well, not really. The Catalyst gets an F5, which needs to charge up almost exactly like a warrior's adrenaline does. In other words, every time you hit stuff, you get some energy. And then, you can place it on the ground as a tiny circle AoE that admittedly looks very lovely, it's very well animated. I love the celestial creatures that occupy the space, and the little Jade Orb projector that flies around it, but it doesn't really do a lot, and has a number of problems. While you have it active, your energy drains over time. You can see how much energy you have by checking the extremely tiny bar above the button on the UI, which is my first suggestion to change. Maybe make this similar to a Druid's Astral Force mechanic above the Endurance bar, which is more obviously visible. The orb will change its elemental field depending on your current element, so as you swap through, you'll swap the orb as well. The orb is fixed in place and cannot move unless you recall it, which deletes all of your remaining energy and puts it on cooldown, essentially punishing you for being tactical and aware. It does a tiny amount of pulsing damage. It pulses boons depending on the element, which means you get some quickness from air, which is nice, I suppose. And it acts as a combo field. And that's it. So while I said the hammer has no combo field access, it's because you have the F5 ability to make those fields, which is good in theory, but in practice I found myself forgetting to use it, moving out of it, forcing myself to move back into it for combos, the fight moving away from it naturally, it taking too long to charge up, it depleting its energy after a fight so you won't have to engage with it next time, and often being on cooldown because I wanted to move it. And all of these problems essentially made it super weak, however important it is to making the hammer do its job. The result, hammer suffers as a weapon because of the reliance on this orb, when the orb itself is unfun to work around. It also has a knock-on effect with the utilities that I mentioned before. Maybe this thing should move around with you, or be able to be moved, manipulated, enlarged, or just something, because right now it's just a lot underwhelming actually for an entire spec mechanic. Well then, perhaps the traits can fix things. Well, sort of. There's a whole line at the bottom here that buffs boon output on the orb, which to me felt super throwaway. Fury, some generic one-time boons per attunement swap, and 50% boon uptime. Wow. I don't see much point in running these when Tempest is another option and the hammer isn't much of a support weapon either. Maybe you could with staff, technically you could provide some quickness in air attunement, but at what cost? The really interesting stuff, and the saviour of the entire Catalyst specialization, comes from the minor traits and the traits that buff those. Auras grant Elemental Empowerment, which gives you a plus 1% buff to all stats, and stacks up to 10%, and all combo finishers grant you an aura, meaning you can get at least one finisher per attunement on a hammer, allowing you multiple auras and multiple stacks of that empowerment buff. This does open up a water-traded catalyst to then use the aura share traits, but I think that Tempest still does that job better. You can also get empowerment from immobilizing or disabling enemies, which lots of your weapons have access to, and one of your Grandmaster traits doubles elemental empowerment to a max of plus 20% bonus to all stats, if you can upkeep it at its max stack value. So while Hammer struggles a lot with keeping those stacks up, with its lack of combo fields, awkward finishes and its rotation, just about any other combination of Elementalist weapons absolutely flourishes with this setup. I did try a boon build with the hammer and some diviner gear and ultimately found it quite dull and uninspired. While quickness was nice, it didn't hold a candle to the fire-air or the fire-earth builds that I tried. Air gives you Zephyr's boon that can keep Fury on you permanently, which is just better than the other trait that the Catalyst has. It can boost your ferocity, open up fresh air builds, and tons more stuff. Air is really good as a trait line. Fire can give you extra fire auras, better might generation, better Condi cleanse, and Pyromancer's puissance for an extra explosion of damage on a power build. Or hell, I was using it on a celestial build too, because it also burns too. Earth can give you better bleeds, more tankiness and improved signets, which can also boost conditions and give more immobilize for a celestial build and for that trait that I mentioned earlier. Focus works out better for PvP with the fire transmute cleansing more conditions, but any combination of daggers, scepter, focus or even staff gives you 5 auras or combo finishing skills. This means not only plenty of access to auras from your traits, but much better uptime on empowered empowerment, which is a whopping plus 20% all stats, remember. This is huge on any build, Celestial Power or Condi, thanks to its percentile scaling. Add empowering auras on top for another 10% damage bonus, and you have a very scary, buffed, core elementalist feeling elite spec to recapture that classic gameplay of juggling combo finishes, but this time to even greater effect. Which is pretty much how I played it. I went full Celestial and tried all sorts of weapon combinations. I've already talked about the hammer and the Jade Orb, and yeah, they worked alright, but I had to work much harder to kill things than with any other weapon set. You see, burning speed from the dagger moves with you and is available more often, same with Ring of Fire and Flame Wall, which means that you can almost always put out a Frozen Burst, Earthquake, Churning Earth, Comet, Magnetic Wave, Earthen Rush, Rock Barrier, Dragon's Tooth or a Phoenix into those fields. and that's a huge amount of options and variety of attunements, so not only are you getting blast finisher benefits, but also those auras on top. And you can of course cast some of these things, and then swap elements mid-cast to get access to, say, a shock aura on your scepter, which wouldn't normally be there. The F5 orb even manages to shore up some of those gaps here too, casting a Dragon's Tooth into an orb field and swapping to Earth for some weakness and a magnetic aura, for example. The creativity is increased on your combo potential with the Catalyst, which is exactly what the name of this spec implies it should be doing. In the open world, I swapped between Scepter Dagger and Double Daggers a lot. Eventually, I think Double Daggers were more familiar and therefore more fun for me, and I got the best results from them. But I think this is a lot of personal preference. I can see Scepter being extremely strong as well. In DRMs, I absolutely struggled against the Caledon boss with my lack of practice and sustain, but with more patience and skill, I can say that it would work just fine. Typical Elementalist problems, really. I definitely got a lot of use out of the Scepter here with the Water Trident skill and Cleansing Wave doing some serious work to keep me alive. And in strikes, well, it's just kind of like a core DPS Ellie, really. Nothing too crazy, but perhaps at least the Jade Orb becomes more easily usable since most bosses don't really move around a lot. I did try Hammer and being a boon bot, but again, it wasn't particularly interesting, having nothing truly unique to offer a group. Honestly, I'd just rather have played Tempest. In conclusion, if you've played Ellie, this is basically the same thing, but with much stronger and more available auras. The Hammer currently struggles to find its niche to fill, unless you like the class fantasy of swinging it around with an elemental flavour. The Jade Orb has a lot of issues, which might change by release, so keep an eye out for that, and augments are mostly forgettable. So, do you want to reminisce the old days of playing a DD Ellie and feeling like an absolute hero, pumping out tons of interesting combos for all manner of boons that you were rewarded for using? Tired of Weaver being a more intense version of that playstyle, and tired of Tempest being a slower paced, often support build? Then Catalyst might be for you. Even though I've not really sold it too well, I think it is still worth a shot. At least the elemental attunement voice lines and most of the animations are neat. So at least it's got that going for it.